So this is my 2023 Surron Ultra B, and these are my first modifications. So these are my first modifications, and let's talk about them. So I decided first things first, I wanted to order Supermoto wheels for it, a Supermoto setup. So one of the main things I wanted the bike was for is to tool around some city streets and cruise around. So first thing on my list was Supermoto wheels. Now I went with Flow wheels. They said they were in stock, ready to ship. I did like how they mentioned that they didn't go overkill on the sizes, so that way it would be lightweight and nimble for the bike, seeing what power it has. So right now, since I'm not going to be upgrading the motor, controller, or battery anytime soon, I kind of wanted to go with this setup so that way I can utilize the most of my power with what I got. So the rear is a 130/70/17. That is on a 3.5 wide wheel. And then the front is a 110/70/17. And that one is on, I believe, a 2.5-inch wheel. Yes, 2.5-inch wheel. So that's the Supermoto wheel setup. Secondly, every bike I usually get, I order a set of handlebars, just because I like to mainly change the grips. So while I'm changing the grips, I change the bars. So with that said, we got ourselves a pair of grips. On these bikes, as you know, the throttle side, the grip is vulcanized to the tube. So you cannot get that off of there. You have to literally like whittle it like it's a piece of wood to get that to come off. So I was going to get the Warp 9, just the throttle tube, but I said, you know what? I'm going to go with the T-Rex billet throttle, and I got the whole assembly here. Looks nice quality, sealed end cap so no dirt gets inside it. We'll put a nice little layer of lithium grease inside there so it snaps real nice and easy. So we also got a one thing coming from regular motorcycles. Riding this without a rear brake, especially after I trained myself to use a rear brake after learning wheelies, feels really funny not having a rear brake there. So I went ahead and I picked up this rear brake kit on Amazon. It wasn't that expensive. It looks like typical Chinese pit bike type parts. My main concern is this master cylinder looks a little bit cheesy, but it's what usually comes on most pit bikes. So hopefully all this will work together. We'll go through that together. We'll install it and we'll see how that works out. With that being said, I picked up a set of gold pads. Not sure if these are any better. They're on Amazon and they're listed as gold pads. So I know that these ones are serrated and they look not bad, but we'll see if the gold are any better. And then just purely for aesthetic purposes, I got an Enjoy seat cover and I got the bump. So the bump is a nice little foam piece that you can get from Factory FX, and it will sit like right here under the seat cover, and it will give you a nice little thing to rub your butt up against. So that's what we got. And I went ahead and picked up a pneumatic staple gun. For anybody that don't know, Using a manual staple gun, putting these on is quite challenging, so I got a pneumatic staple gun, should make that really easy. So let's go ahead and dive into it. Okay, so a little top tip for you here. Anytime you got your wheel off or you're doing any kind of upgrades or maintenance, now is a great time to get in there and get all that grime that you normally can't get when the wheel's on. So take a minute, clean all that stuff up, give her a nice little wipe down. Your bike will thank you. Alright, so what had happened here is after fussing with the things a couple times, you saw I thought I was going to be able to slide it over and get it on there, and I was just being lazy. I didn't want to take the switches apart, but always the slower way is always the faster way. Remember that. So I should have just did it in the first place. But anyways, as you saw, when I slid this housing into the stock housing, I popped the spring out. And that's when I realized that I was going to have to take the whole front of the bike, either take the bars back off or take the number plate off and disconnect it, cut the zip ties, take it apart, put the spring back in it, and this thing in my hand, and then put it back together. So we're all together. We're all better. Let's get into installing these grips. Okay, so as you can see, we got all of the first modifications done to the Surron Ultra B. I couldn't be happier with what I chose to do. The bars are actually just slightly higher than the stock ones, so with the 2-inch rise that I already had, it's like perfect for me. The gripper seat really locks me in. I don't know how I feel about the the hump. It didn't really turn out as good. It wasn't wide enough, and I don't know. You can kind of feel it. It kind of helps you lock in. Surprisingly, it's kind of harder to wheelie now with the Supermoto setup as opposed to the 19, which is surprising to me. Seems like it popped up a lot easier with the 19, but with the 19 too, it was a lot more like twitchy, and I almost looped it out twice. So that compared to with getting used to the electric bike throttle and being used to gas bikes. So but when I did get it up, it was a lot smoother and it did feel a lot better with these, and it felt like I was more able to control it and get used to it. So overall, super happy. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching along. Hopefully we'll get some more modifications, some more riding videos, some more content in the future. But stay tuned. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it.